Go here.
Thanks.
Yeah, okay. So Beth St. Clair is with us this afternoon, and she's going to walk us through something that may be on the screen. Are we going to be able to get?
Oh, I hadn't planned to share my screen. I can have it posted.
We can pull it up on our devices.
Yes.
That would be, yeah, why don't we do that then? If it's there, Laura, for us to,
Yeah, I'll just see if you can
Had it.
okay.
Anyway.
And while we're trying to get that device, if you want to,
You want me to introduce myself?
go ahead and.
Sure. Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. I have not had the pleasure of appearing in this committee either last year or this year, so hello. It's nice to meet you all. This is my second session with the legislature. I am not a new attorney, but I am new-ish to the legislature. But I had the pleasure of picking up the Universal School Meals Bill last year towards the end of the session and kind of shepherding it through passage. So I will most likely be sticking with that topic. Do you want me to, does everyone have, I sent over a 2-pager. It's really, so what I'm going to give a brief primer or explanation on is the requirement that the Agency of Education create a universal income declaration form. That language very briefly appeared in S100, which is the Universal School Meals Bill from last session. And then it was taken out, but it had always lived in one form or another in S287, which became Act 127, which is the pupil waiting bill. So that's where this requirement, it's not in the Universal School Meals Bill, it's in the pupil waiting bill. So rather than go through 42 pages of education funding, pulled out, it's just section 9 in Act 127. It's pages 16 and 17. And so you should have those 2 pages in front of you.
Now I have it behind
Great.
your shoulder too.
Excellent. Okay. So very simply, and I'm going to speak to what the law, the requirements that the law created. If you have questions about the intent or how the envisioning of the use of this form, I think those questions would probably be better answered by the agency, but I will do my best to answer questions. So in Act 127, Section 9 required the creation of the Universal Income Declaration form. And part of that had to do with capturing economic information related to pupil weights. So there are new in our education funding system, the costs of students, every student costs a little bit more or less than the next, depending on age, right? An elementary school student is cheaper to educate than a high school student. And then there are also other factors that go into how we calculate the costs of educating our students, including economic background. And so how do we capture that information? The thought here is we're going to start using the Universal Income Declaration form to capture some of that information. How does that play into universal meals that we're talking about today? Historically, when you're thinking about school meals and the subsidizing of them, we're thinking of free and reduced price lunches or breakfasts. And I'm sure you've all heard of the free and reduced price lunches form, where families who think they may be eligible for that program might be filling that out. This is a more universal, the contemplation here is a more universal form. So you can see in subdivision or in subsection B there, the Universal Income Declaration form is used to collect income bracket information from all families, reducing and stigma and resulting in the collection of more accurate pupil eligibility counts throughout a school district. So it would be just that universal, it would be everyone. And the form does not, I assume you'll hear the agency testify that there has been a similar form that the agency has used. But for the purposes of this legislation, this requires AOE to honor before October 1st, 2022, so just last October, to convene a working group, including school staff and hunger and nutrition experts to develop the form. And so that the form is fully accessible in both paper and electronic formats. And then going on to page 17, this legislation requires that the form is created by July 1, 2023, and that it is implemented for next school year, the 23-24 school year. And then it tasks AOE with coming up for a process with verifying the accuracy of the data. And then there's an appropriation for this fiscal year for costs associated with the creation of the form. And that's it. It's a very small piece of this much larger bill. Does anyone have any questions on?
Representative Pearl.
So currently, like if there was a family today that wanted or needed free or universal free lunch, essentially, what is the process right now?
So today, because of S100 Act 151, all children in public schools in the state of Vermont receive free breakfast and lunch. It was a 1-year program. It is the session law that creates that is set to be repealed on July 1, 2023. So today it's free for all public school students.
Follow up. So why is it that milk, if you get free milk, if you get a free lunch, milk is free. But if you choose to bring your own lunch, you have to buy milk?
It's a great question for the agency.
Okay.
Oh, that's really good. Great question. Yes, Representative Wilson.
How would that be funded,
How will what be funded?
the free lunch?
So right now, Act 151, the Universal School Meals Act, was funded through an appropriation from I don't want to misspeak here, education fund. And so remember, there was a surplus in the education fund last year. There was a large surplus in the education fund. And so there were 29 million appropriated out of the education fund last year for the 1-year Universal School Meals Program.
Representative Levitt.
What I've understood is it's coming in under the 29 million. It's coming, I thought it was coming more closer to like 20 million.
I do not know.
Okay. And then another question, just along the milk line. Are they kids not allowed to have chocolate milk?
Oh, I have no idea. That's a great question for the
I've had
agency.
constituents write me and say, how come they can have white milk, but they can't have chocolate milk?
The free meal aspect, we're not talking about the a la carte items, like pizza and, whatever Doritos, whatever goodies. There are federal programs under federal legislation that create programs and provide funding and incentives related to breakfast and lunch in schools. And there's a whole bunch of parameters around what that means. And I am not the best person to speak to that. I believe you have Rosie Kruger coming in. Oh, Rosie's here. She'll be able to speak to all of that. But you're asking great questions.
In about 5 minutes. Representative O'Brien.
So say New England, are there other states that have universal meals or have for a while? And then also if you could speak to if they're using this universal income declaration.
Oh, I don't know the answer to that. I believe Maine had, at least last session, the testimony I heard was that Maine had implemented universal school meals. Again, Rosie is going to know, my guess is, who in New England is or isn't doing this. The Universal Income Declaration form, the data that it captures is used for a lot of different programs, not just meals programs or pupil weights. So I don't know how other states collect that same data for the various different programs that income of the families they serve might be helpful.
So, other questions? Well, we have legislative counsel here about language specifically, because I think that most of the questions that are probably on our minds will be better directed to our next witness, and anything that she can't answer, we can get answers to. But as far as the actual language goes, you may remember last week, maybe it was the week before, we had Mike O'Grady come in and walk us through everything that this committee passed out last session, and there were 13 or 14 pieces of legislation. And one of the bills that came through was S-100 that established for this current fiscal year the Universal School Meals Program. And for those who weren't here during the pandemic, there was federal money for breakfast and lunch universal, and then that was going away. So there was an interest in extending it. So this bill extended it, but only for 1 year. So we'll be hearing shortly more about that, and then possibly looking ahead will be a conversation that we also have. The reason that we had Beth with us today was that Mike didn't go over this legislation with us because it wasn't a bill that it actually wasn't in this committee. I don't think it would have been a reason for that bill to be in this committee. So it was just a little piece that was apropos, but we hadn't gotten a chance to look at. So, and sort of coming at everybody all at once here, it's probably a little confusing, and we'll try to get everything sort of straightened out about timelines and why this matters. But that's available. It's now on our page. So if there aren't any other questions, and next time you're in, we have more time, we'll take a little more time to just introduce ourselves to you.
Great.
And we hope we do see you again.
Great. Yes. Well, if you take up this issue, I think I will be sticking with it. I'm not sure that it'll go to Mike. I think I'll stick with it. So thank you. I'm going to hop back and watch your testimony from my office, if that's okay, or would you like me to stick around?
I don't think that you need to stick around. We'll come find you if we need you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, yeah, we can move right into, now we've got, okay. Yeah, okay. Have a seat, Rosie, and we've got another committee coming in, so we just ought to be sure that they're on board with us. So while we're waiting, and maybe we're not waiting anymore, but I don't know what your time is like, and we've got, I think, the next hour plus booked out, but maybe we could just quickly go around since we haven't met you before and introduce ourselves.
Sure, yeah.
Yep, and Representative Templeman, why don't you start?
David Templeman, Orleans 3, Brownington, Barton, and Westmore.
Charles Wilson, Caledonia 3, which is Lyndonville, Sheffield, Wheelock, Sutton, and Newark.
Henry Pearl, Caledonia, Washington District, Danville, Peachum, Kent.
No, I think it needs to come together, but maybe. That's not really.
Good, welcome, Education Committee. We're just introducing ourselves to our witness, and then we'll invite you to say hello too, for equal treatment, but we'll go going on the table here.
Thank you. Jed Lipsky, Lamoille 1, Town of Stowe.
Rodney Graham, Orange 3, which is Williamstown and Chelsea.
And I'm David Durfee from Shaftesbury. I represent Bennington 3, also Glastonbury and Sunderland.
Heather Supernaut, Windsor 4, Barnard, Pomfret, and Bridgewater.
Esme Cole, Windsor 6, Hartford.
We're waiting for more.
I know, you got it.
John O'Brien, Windsor Orange 1, Royalton, my hometown of coverage.
Mike Rice, Bennington, Rutland, Dorset, Danby, Landgrove, Mount Tabor.
Josie Levitt, Grandal, Chittenden, all of Grandal County, and a sliver of West Milton.
Yeah. And would you like to
Yeah, so
introduce yourself and then
for the record, Rosie Kruger, I'm the State Director of Child Nutrition Programs at the Agency of Education. And I manage a team of 8 folks at the agency who manage all of the federal child nutrition programs for the state of Vermont. So these are federal programs, but we are the state agency that implements them here in Vermont, and work with the folks in schools and childcares and nonprofit organizations in all of your districts to actually offer the programs here in Vermont. And I believe we should be having two other folks from the Agency of Education joining as well today, and we may kind of, depending on where your questions lie, some of them might be more appropriate for them as well. But I
Will
don't.
they be joining us remotely?
So it's Ann Bordenaro and Bob Keeley, and I think they were both planning to join remotely. I know that Bob has a hard stop at 2:00. He's more available to talk about the household income form. I'm obviously going to be focusing on the universal meals side of things. And I don't have a hard stop, so I'm happy to stay longer, but for the household income.
Great. And do you have something that we should be looking at either on our devices?
Yeah, so the agency has submitted the universal meals report that you requested by January 15th. So that was submitted and that's been posted to the report section of the legislature's website. I may have that's it. It looks like this. And so I'll be sort of informally walking you through that and really here to answer your questions about that.
Okay, good. And I do want to not lose sight of the fact that we've got the House Education Committee with us as well remotely. And Representative Conlon, you're hearing us all right? And did you want to introduce your folks?
You hear you great. We'll save individual introductions to maybe the next time we have Rosie in our committee room, but we are the House Education Committee.
All right, thank you. And thank you for being with us. That report I know was, I think, sent out earlier today. Laura, did you email that?
It's
report?
on the committee page under reports and resources.
Perfect. Under reports. So I guess we'll just let you begin then. And if folks have questions, would you prefer that they hold them or?
Well, so I can answer those questions that you originally brought up. I wasn't going to particularly direct my testimony to those today, but we can go ahead and get those out of the way if you'd like. Or
Okay.
So the question about milk, and this sounds like a reasonable question. It comes up periodically.
Would you mind just restating the question so we're all sure?
Yeah. So there was a question about, this year meals are free. So a child can take a complete meal with a milk and that's served at no charge to the child. But if a child brings a meal from home and wants to take a milk, they're charged for that milk. And the reason for that is because of the federal programs and federal funding that we're using to fund the programs. So the way that this works is we have the federal National School Lunch Program and School Breakfast Program, and they fund they fund a fixed reimbursement rate per meal served that meets their requirements. And so there's a meal pattern of what has to be included in that meal to meet their requirements. And of that, milk has to be offered. The children are not required to take milk, but it has to be offered. And if the child qualifies for free meals, the federal government reimburses the school at the free rate, which is considered to be the full cost of the meal. They reimburse the school a lesser amount at the reduced price rate if the child qualifies for reduced price meals, which means their family is between 130 and 185% of the federal poverty level. And they do reimburse some for a so-called paid meal, which is a family that doesn't qualify for free or reduced price meals. There is actually a federal subsidy for those meals. But then under normal circumstances, the household would pay for the remaining cost of that meal. In Vermont, the state has for many years paid for the reduced price cost of the meal, so that for reduced price families, the family pays nothing, but the state pays for the 40 cents for lunch and 30 cents for breakfast. And that's been a long time initiative in Vermont that the legislature started funding many years ago. So universal meals, the state is paying for what would be the family's share of the paid price meal. But meanwhile, we're drawing down all these federal funds to cover the remainder of those costs for those meals. And so the federal government will reimburse for that complete reimbursable meal, but they won't reimburse for just a single milk. So because there's no state funding for it, that has to come from the family.
Yep.
And the the meals programs can't subsidize that. So one of the reasons we have to put these state funds in is there are specific federal requirements that those funds that they're providing for the free and reduced price meals can't be used to either subsidize the cost of paid student meals or subsidize other things like a la carte items. So that's the answer to that question. The chocolate milk question. So there was a question about why, whether households or whether children are offered chocolate milk and is that allowed? And so the federal meal pattern requires that children be offered 2 types of milk, and it does not allow for whole milk or 2% milk. So you have to have milk choice. So that milk choice can be skim milk and 1% non-flavored, or it can include a flavored milk offering, which could include chocolate as the most common. Strawberry is the other one that we see out there. There's no federal requirement that you offer chocolate specifically as long as you're offering that milk choice. So some schools do offer, the fat-free and reduced fat or 1% milk as a way of offering that choice. Other schools offer the chocolate milk. Specific school wellness policies, which schools are required to have a wellness policy, that wellness policy could decide that the school is not going to offer chocolate milk.
Right.
And there's a lot of research out there about whether it's, basically the additional sugars in flavored milk, whether that is kind of worth the trade-off of making it more palatable to kids. So lots of folks have opinions on that, but it is something that we don't specifically regulate at the state level.
Okay, thank you.
The school has the freedom, of course, if they're.
Okay, thank you.
I'm just going to say here, I think if you've got a question about the chocolate milk.
I do.
Go ahead, yes, but then maybe we should probably
Jump in the universe.
get into.
Yeah.
But did you say that whole milk and 2% are not offered?
They are not allowed to be offered by the federal rules.
And why is that, do you know?
The meal pattern is based on the most recent dietary guidelines for Americans, which at this point are at least 10 years old. They're currently issuing new dietary guidelines. It's possible that will change when the new dietary guidelines are issued. It usually takes a little bit of time after the guidelines are issued for USDA to then update the meal pattern based on that. There's a lot of conversation about that at the national level about whether that would be a good thing or not. But we have no freedom at the state level to do something different if we want to continue to draw down those federal funds.
All right.
So you all passed S100 Act 151 last session, and that provided for a 1 year of state funding to cover the cost of those paid meals that I was talking about. It was required for all public schools to offer the program, and that's something we've had a requirement for many years for all public schools to offer school meals through the National School Lunch Program, but there was an exemption process. And so Act 151 actually eliminated that exemption process. And we had 2 schools that were using that previously, Marion Cross in Norwich and Wyndham Elementary, and they have since started offering the program. And Act 151 required that all schools not only participate in the National School Lunch Program, but all public schools also offer meals at no charge to students. Act 151 made that state funding to cover the difference in federal reimbursement and what those paid student meals would cost, made that contingent on the school offering a federal provision that would draw down the most federal funding. And so those 2 existing options in the federal programs to allow for universal meals are called the Community Eligibility Provision and Provision 2. And I really suggest looking back at last year's report of the Universal Meals Task Force. That was something that the prior year the legislature had asked us to write that kind of outlined all of our options for offering universal meals. And that report goes very in depth to how exactly Provision 2 and CEP work. But those are 2 options that have long been available to schools to offer universal meals, but they require local funding to offset that costs that those paid families would have paid, so that the free and reduced price costs or reimbursements are not subsidizing those paid meals. And that was really the sticking point. There were a number of schools prior to COVID who were offering universal meals using those provisions, but they were mostly the higher poverty schools where they were able to draw down more federal funding. There were a few schools in Slate Valley, was one supervisory union that was doing this, that were not considered to be lower poverty, but that had decided to offer those universal meals anyway using local funding. So it was sort of a scattered approach across the state where we had some schools offering universal meals and some not. The community eligibility provision is available only to the highest poverty schools. But under the community eligibility provision, you do not need to collect free and reduced meal applications. Reimbursement is based on the number of children who are directly certified for free and reduced price meals, for free meals, I should say, through their participation in other means tested programs. And the biggest one of those is Three Squares Vermont, which is known federally as SNAP. So most of the schools who could participate in CEP prior to COVID were participating in it. And then provision 2 is an option that's available to any school that doesn't qualify for CEP. Under provision 2, you do have to collect free and reduced meal applications in the first year of your participation because you need to see the status of the children who are eating and track that. And then in subsequent years, you claim for free and reduced price meals based on the percentage of children who ate in your first year who qualify for free and reduced price meals. So one of the big questions, we had a lot of questions kind of going into universal meals about how much this was going to cost. That was really the big concern for the legislature last year. And we didn't have a really good way of giving you estimates because it really depended on 2 big variables. And the first variable was how many children participate. Once all meals are free, we can assume that more children are going to eat, but we didn't know how many more children. And the other variable is the number of households in those provision 2 schools that would continue to return free and reduced meal applications once meals are free. So those had kind of been sticking points for a while. And during COVID, as was mentioned earlier, the federal government paid for all meals to be offered for free. So we were sort of in this situation where we were coming out of that federal funding for universal meals ended in June of 2022. And families had not been submitting free and reduced meal applications or paying for meals for more than 2 years at that point. And so we weren't really sure how households were going to react. Would kids eat at school if all the meals are free, or how many kids would eat, and how many households would return those applications? And there were a wide range of estimates for cost based on, at the worst case scenario, quote unquote worst case being that all students ate and no households returned applications. So we were just basing our free reimbursement on that certification rate. And then the quote unquote best case scenario in terms of cost, which would be no change in participation, no additional kids eating, and all the same households continuing to submit free and reduced meal applications. So in the first couple months of the school year, we now have some data on that. We do have data on how many households returned applications, and we have preliminary data on participation. But that data is incomplete because schools have 60 days from the end of the month to submit their application or submit their claims to us for reimbursement. So we're 2 months behind in the data, which means that we only have complete data through October. And then the other thing that makes that a little bit, that first data not perfect, is that schools are allowed to carry over their free and reduced eligibility status for students from the prior year, or in this case, from the prior, all of the COVID years, for the first 30 operating days of the school year, which is mid-October. So we don't at this point have any good data on how many free and reduced and paid students are actually eating, but we do now have, like I said, that data on application return rates. So for application return rates, we found that there was an impact. Fewer households did return applications, but it wasn't as dire as it would have been if no households had returned applications. So we mentioned this in the report. It's over 3,000 households did in fact return applications. And our free and reduced percentage statewide went from about 38% pre-COVID to about 34% at this point, as of this fall. So definitely a drop, but we would have expected to see a larger drop if no households had returned applications. I will say that the agency did a ton of work to try and support schools in collecting applications this year, and that work was also supported by Hunger Free Vermont. We did a whole Fill the Form campaign, pushing households to return those applications. And schools really reported a huge variance in how successful they were in receiving applications. In some cases, there's really was no change to that school's free and reduced rate. And in some cases, we saw a huge drop in the number of children qualifying. And we don't really have any information to explain why it was so different from school to school. You know, certainly we can expect that some of them engaged more or less in the Fill the Form campaign. But even within that, we have schools who said, you know, we did everything and we could not get households to return applications. We also had situations where schools said, well, we had a really easy time getting the upper income families to return applications, but those low income families weren't returning applications. So we collected a ton of applications, but all those kids qualified as paid rather than free or reduced. So those didn't help the rates.
Representative O'Brien.
So prior to COVID, with the free and reduced, how was that data collected from those same families that you'd like to?
Yeah, so in those schools that were offering universal meals prior to COVID, is that what you're asking? Or just in general?
Just in general.
So in general, so at the start of the school year, households are, you know, the free and reduced meal application is sent home. And households, you know, if you're charging for meals, you're telling the households that meals are available. This is the price. If you believe you qualify, or, you know, please fill out this free and reduced meal application. And they'll fill it out. And if they're under 130%, they qualify for free. If they're 135% of the federal poverty level for their household size. If they're between 130 and 185%, then they qualify for reduced price. And then when that student eats, that's tracked, and the state receives that claim for reimbursement from the school, and then we turn around and submit that to the federal government, and that's how the meal's paid for. You were asking how we collect the information?
Well, is it different data, different forms, say in 2019 and this one we're talking about?
It's a federal form. So for the free and reduced meal application, that is a federal form, and it's basically the same. That there hasn't really been a change to that. We actually tried to make the letter simpler this year. We actually brought down the reading level of the letter that went out along with the application this year. And we translated it into more languages this year than we normally did. So we made a lot of efforts. And a lot of schools did move to offering an electronic free and reduced application this year as well. That helped some, but again, not as much as we had hoped. So that's those schools that are participating in Provision 2. Those are the schools that aren't the highest poverty. For schools that are participating in CEP, the community eligibility provision, I mentioned those schools earlier. We have about 91 schools who qualify for that this year. And for schools who are in anything other than their first year of Provision 2, the federal government does not allow us to collect a free and reduced meal application because it's not needed. The whole point of those programs is we don't actually need this application anymore after that base year of Provision 2 or at all in CEP. So we're not allowed to collect the free and reduced meal application, which is why we collect the household income form. And we don't collect it at the state level. That's something that schools collect. And that none of that information is used for child nutrition programs purposes. We don't need it for child nutrition programs, but it is used for a whole bunch of other educational purposes. And Ann and Bob, my colleagues at the agency, can speak more to those if you've got questions about those. So as was kind of mentioned in the prior testimony, we then take all that data about the number of kids who qualify for free and reduced price meals or who qualify as low income via the household income form, and we use that for all those other educational purposes. So we saw as well that those return rates for the household income form Those declined this year as well, and that's in the report. You can see going back to 2019, what our overall low-income percentages were across the state, and there was a drop in those that kind of was similar to the drop in students qualifying for free and reduced price meals as well. The report kind of gives some other information about how implementation in general is going. I can speak to that. I can also kind of answer general questions of what I've just said so far.
Are there questions from the Education Committee? Anybody, Representative Kalman, who would like to ask a question now?
Yeah, we have a question from Representative Austin.
Yep. Thanks, Rosie, for this presentation. Again, you said that, you know, when you look at the education, the AOE's dashboard, when you're looking at data, like for proficiencies in literacy and math, you know, there is, you know, different categories. One of them is free and reduced lunch. One is non-free and reduced lunch. And I think you just said that the education, the agency has a way to continue, you know, separating those two demographic groups. So is that accurate? So that data, or somehow that data, will be available?
So the attempt to collect that data when we're not able to get it from the free and reduced meal application is through the household income form. We will also be able to continue collecting direct certification information. So that's the number of children who are participating, who are in households that receive other means tested programs. And one of the things that's mentioned in the report is that the agency was just approved to participate in USDA's direct certification through Medicaid pilot. And we're very excited about this. This is a joint effort between AOE, several divisions in AOE, as well as the Department of Vermont Health Access and the Agency of Digital Services. So under this pilot, we will be able to match students who participate in Medicaid who fall within those income thresholds. We'll be able to directly certify them for free or reduced price meals. And the initial data from DEVA is showing us that we don't have like actual student matches at this point, but looking at the overall universe of kids in this age range falling within those income categories, we think starting next year when we're starting that pilot, we may be able to replace the previous free and reduced income data with direct cert Medicaid data that basically all of the children, maybe even plus more children who were previously qualifying for free and reduced meals through applications will now be directly certified for free or reduced price meals through Medicaid. So that's very exciting. One, because it's going to bring down the costs potentially of universal meals, but also because it will deal with this problem that we're having of not being able to collect that income data. And there is more about that pilot in the report. Bob or Ann, I don't know if you want to say more about those efforts on the household income form.
Yeah, we were going to talk about that a little bit later. Rosie's pretty much covered it for now. We are not concerned to the original question that we won't be able to identify students who are low income versus non-low income in some way moving forward. It's a requirement, so we will do that. But the question is which ways are easier and harder. And certainly when we're reliant on forms as part of our metric for student poverty, are a substantial component of our metric for student poverty, and then we have trouble getting forms from families, that's a challenge. So the Medicaid demonstration pilot is really exciting because if it reduces our reliance on those forms, it will provide better and more accurate data to continue to inform things like the dashboard that you're seeing, where we disaggregate student performance by students in poverty and students not in poverty.
Excuse me, Ann, I should have asked you both to introduce yourselves when you popped up on the screen, but just for the record, would you introduce yourself?
Sure, and I'm so sorry, I have a really weird sounding voice today. I'm getting over a cold, so I apologize. I'm Ann Bordenaro, and I'm the Division Director for Federal Programs at the Agency of Ed.
Great, thanks and welcome.
And I was going to say, I'm Bob Keeley. I'm the Deputy Director for the Data Management Analysis Division at AOE.
Well, welcome to both of you. And how about other questions from the Education Committee?
I'm going to guess, we'll learn more about the income forms as you go along, I assume, before we ask any more questions about that. It's such a crucial piece of the whole puzzle that it's important that we get that information.
Yeah. Good, okay.
I just had a,
Representative O'Brien.
do universal school meals cover pre-K or PCCs?
That's a great question. If a school or grade is part of the kind of recognized school system in Vermont, then that site can be covered as a part of the National School Lunch Program. So previous to this, we had, some pre-Ks that were located at schools would participate. And when you're offering the National School Lunch Program, it has to be made available to every student at that location. So you can't just say like, we're not going to serve first grade or whatever, it's, so those pre-K students, if they were attending pre-K in a school building where school meals were offered, they were able to receive the program. Because of universal meals and because of the flexibilities that we've had during COVID, during COVID, we were seeing a lot of schools actually expand to pre-K and childcares in their communities because they had that opportunity to offer free meals. And we have seen a few schools extend that further this year with offering, with that state funding. And so basically adding childcares or pre-K sites within their community that aren't at the school building. And as long as they have a pre-K, that's a state pre-K, those meals can qualify for the federal funds. Obviously, they're also drawing down state funds as well. And that's not something that we really anticipated. So that is highlighted in the report. We don't really have any estimates of how much that could grow, but that is something to think about in future years. Right now, the school meals programs are really, they've got limited capacity. They've been doing a lot extra for all of the COVID years. They've got staffing shortages. They're dealing with just, constantly changing federal rules. So we heard from folks who wanted to offer meals to more pre-Ks in their communities and decided they couldn't do that, or they had been offering during COVID and decided that they needed to stop. But I would expect over the long term, if you made no changes, that schools would continue to add those pre-K sites within their community and draw down the state funds to pay for all those meals. So that's something for you all to think about. Do you want to make any changes to the legislation to either allow for that or not allow for that, understanding that it could have an impact on costs? So that's, definitely a topic for consideration.
Representative Lipsky.
Rosie, thank you. And to follow up on Representative O'Brien's question, and I'm new to the House, and it was made clear that early childhood care and education was not under the purview of the Department of Education, and it was more responsibility of families and children. But there's a big push currently, Let's Grow Kids and other initiatives to fund early child care and education. And I understand for some of those programs in our community that they do offer at least 2 meals, and some, when they're expensive programs, have very, nutritious focused meals, and they're very important. But from my understanding, that's not under the Department of Ed.
Well, that's a great question, and actually that's not correct. So I mentioned that we operate all the federal meals programs for the state agency for all the federal child nutrition programs. So another program that we operate is called the Child and Adult Care Food Program. That is not a required program, but it is open to child care centers, daycare homes, through a daycare home sponsor, as well as it is available to adult day centers, and it can be used in emergency shelters and for after-school suppers in low-income areas. So that is a program where we are able to draw down those federal funds to feed those students. So for those programs where maybe it's a childcare center where they don't have a pre-K, or the local school has decided to not take them under their purview as a school food authority, the child and adult care food program is available to them. It's a very similar program in terms of, you have to serve a meal that meets the meal pattern requirements, and then you get a set USDA reimbursement for that, depending on either if the program is in a low income area, then all of the meals will be served for free, or if it's not, then it's based on the income status of the child or the child's household in terms of whether it's reimbursed fully by the federal government. But that program does exist. I think there's a huge room for growth in that program. We've lost quite a few providers during COVID, some because they closed, but in general because of the paperwork. And that they were trying to do so much else, and they had such staffing shortages that they felt like they couldn't do all the paperwork, and so needed to stop offering it. So we're hoping to get those providers back on and do outreach to new providers, but it's definitely available and something that we'd love to see expanded, for sure.
Representative Rice.
Is there an estimate of what the impact would be to cost of universal school meals if Medicaid direct certification is implemented?
So we haven't done out the numbers, particularly because we haven't actually, we just have this kind of total ballpark number of students ages 5 to 18 from the Department of Vermont Health Access that fall within our income parameters, but we haven't started yet to do the matching to find out, okay, are these kids actually at school? But we think that it will basically replace the number of kids who are qualifying for free and reduced price meals prior to COVID. So bring us up to back up to like that 38% free and reduced eligible status. So that would bring us kind of down to the lower end of the estimates going forward. Again, depending on participation. So that brings us down in terms of the number of paid students, but then there's that participation question. The other thing that is in the report that is also potentially good news for the cost of universal meals going forward is that USDA is proposing a rule change. They've just noticed us that they're going to issue this proposed rule. So they're going to issue the proposed rule in July. Presumably it won't go then into effect until school year 24-25. So this is kind of longer term. But it would bring down the threshold for schools to participate in the community eligibility provision. So it would mean that, we're now going to have higher direct certification rates because of Medicaid. That's the number of kids who don't have to qualify via an application. Under the community eligibility provision, we take that direct certification rate and we multiply it by 1.6%. And that's the number of meals that are reimbursed at the free rate by the federal government. And then the state or the locality needs to pay for the remainder of the meals. So obviously any lowering in that threshold to participate means more schools can participate and take advantage of that 1.6 multiplier to draw down more federal funding. So we think it's going to have a good impact, but we don't have an estimate of what exactly that will be because we don't know what threshold they're going to set it at yet.
I know that you mentioned that at least one of your colleagues needed to.
Yeah, so Bob has a hard stop at 2:00. And Bob is your person, if you've got questions about the household income form and the agency's efforts on that, or how that side of things is all Bob. And that's partially because I'm paid for with federal child nutrition funding. And because the household income form is not needed for child nutrition programs, I can't really work on that. So that work is done elsewhere at the agency.
And I think most of us probably didn't get a chance to look thoroughly anyway through the report before we met this afternoon. So if there's information in the report about the current form or the anticipated, the universal form, would that be questions for Bob to speak to? Or if it's not in the report and there's something you'd like to say, Bob?
Sure. I think mainly I'd want to respond to any questions right off the bat that folks want to have answered now. And if they're in the report, great, we can cover them. If I don't have the answers, we can do some researching of notes or emails to get those answers for folks. So there is time before 2 to ask me questions and I can see if I can answer them. I will mention that it is a collaborative effort between DMAD, we call ourselves the Data Management and Analysis Division, and ANS Division, which is the Federal Education Support Program Division, FESP, for household income forms. But we do have 2 positions that are added to our division in order to support this work.
Great. Representative Conlon, any immediate questions from your committee?
I guess, given the importance of these forms in terms of drawing down federal dollars, that's obviously very important to our programs going forward. Do you have a sense of if we had sort of difference between what we're getting for response rates now and if we had full response, what the difference is in federal dollars that we're kind of missing out on to help fund universal school meals?
Rosie, I'm not sure if that's what was referenced in page 6 of the report that you pointed out to me.
Well, so I'll see the household income form has no impact on drawing down federal funds to pay for school meals.
All right, okay.
It impacts all the other education programs that use that low income data.
Okay. So Rosie, then earlier when you were testifying about response rates, which form were you talking about?
So we saw a decline in both. And page 6 of the report talks about the household income form and gives you a nice little chart on that. And then I think it's earlier in the report, we talk about the decline for free and reduced meal applications.
All right, so can you speak at all to the reduction in the response rate on free and reduced meal applications and sort of what the implications are for reduced federal contributions to the program?
Yeah, so prior to COVID, we had a free and reduced rate of around 38% and statewide. And now we have a free and reduced rate of around 34% statewide. But that is including all of the schools that qualified for the community eligibility provision. So they are sort of artificially inflating that number. And at the end of the report, there's an appendix that shows the change from in all the schools in the state. And it shows whether they are participating in the community eligibility provision or in provision 2. So the biggest fluctuations or the biggest decreases we saw were in provision 2 schools where they actually needed to collect those applications. Going back to the cost estimates last year, the low range of those cost estimates, which I think was like $21 million, if I recall correctly, that was assuming that we were able to maintain the current at that point, free and reduced rate of 38%. And also assuming kind of an average participation, I think of 60 or 70% average data participation in the programs. One thing I pointed out in the report that we did not take into account in those cost estimates was the annual change in the federal reimbursement rate for free and reduced price meals. And normally that changes by just a few cents every year. It increases every year based on CPI. But this and some other factors. In July of 2022, USDA increased both the free and the paid reimbursement rate, but they didn't increase them by the same amount. So the difference between the free and paid reimbursement rates grew, and that's the amount that the state is contributing. We're calling that the universal meal supplement, that difference in those rates. That grew to, I think, $3.56 per lunch, I think is the number. And we've done the estimates based on assuming that would be $3.18 for lunch, which was the previous amount in the prior year. So that obviously has a big impact as well on cost. And so something that we didn't really kind of take into account. You have in Act 151, you all set the reimbursement rate to be the difference. So you didn't need to do anything to, put in an escalator or anything. That's already in there. But in terms of just appropriating for that, you all need to keep in mind that that amount will change, likely increase every year.
Just for clarification, we had an increase in federal reimbursement rates for the two levels, but it ended up, in fact, the program ended up costing more as a result of that, because in Vermont, there's really no such thing as somebody paying a reduced rate. You either get a free lunch, this pre-COVID, you either get free lunch or your full pay. And it's that difference that makes the difference in why it costs more than what was perhaps estimated at the low end?
So Act 151 sets the amount that the state is going to pay, which we called the Universal Meals Supplement. That was what we decided to call it at the agency. I don't think you gave it a name in Act 151. It sets that amount to the difference between the federal paid and the federal free reimbursement rate. And that's very important because the federal laws, like I was mentioning earlier, they don't allow you to subsidize the paid meals with the free meals. And so we had to come up with a non-federal source of funds to cover that cost between the free and paid meals. And if we had said, well, the state's going to pay $2, which is less than that difference per meal, that wouldn't have met those federal requirements that the free meals not subsidize the paid meals. So you did that all properly in terms of the federal requirements, but because it was, we did the calculations of how much it was going to cost based on their federal paid and federal free rates last year, and then they increased both of those, but they didn't increase them by the same amount. So there was now the previous difference between those two rates last year was at $3.18 for lunch. And this year, the difference between those amounts is $3.56 per lunch. And similar change for breakfast as well, although breakfast is, breakfast went from $1.57 difference to $1.76 difference. So that obviously just changes the math.
Great, thank you very much.
Bob, knowing that you've got to jump off here, and then not seeing any other questions, is there anything that you would just sort of high level want to call our attention to take key takeaways in the report that are sort of fall under your jurisdiction?
Not necessarily in the report, but if there's questions specifically about the recruitment and hiring of the positions to support the household income form, I actually shared my notes with Anne, so she has everything that I have prepared in reference for this. But if they're essentially, we do have one of the two positions hired and at the agency now, working to prepare for this. We are in the process of hiring the second position.
Has that been a challenge, recruiting?
Yes, we had to fail the first round of recruitment or search because there wasn't a qualified candidate for the second position, which we are actively interviewing for now.
And I could just add a little context on that. For many years, we've had a paper household income form, which was used by those schools who are participating in CEP and Provision 2 previously. But what the legislature has asked was that the agency come up with an electronic version of that form. And that was one of the things that those positions have been assigned to do.
So thank you very much, Bob. And if you need to jump off, I don't think there are any other questions that I'm seeing anyway. We know where to find you if questions do come up. But before we leave the topic anyway, for those folks who, and which is probably most of us, weren't focused on the section of legislation that dealt with the creation of the universal income form, we've been talking about the household income and the free and reduced price. Can you give us a little bit of background on what the universal income form is and how it might differ from what it's intended to be, how it might differ from the other forms?
I think the universal income form is just another name that's given to the household income form. It's anything that's not the free and reduced meal application, but collects information on household income for non-child nutrition program purposes.
Okay, so when you're talking about household income form, it's synonymous essentially with what we're thinking is what's described in the legislation as universal income form. Okay. Okay.
So I guess the next thing I might talk to you all about is participation, because that is another factor impacting costs. And so we did see an increase in participation from about 50% average daily participation prior to COVID for lunch to about 60% as of October for lunch. So that means that of the enrollment, about 60% of those students were eating lunch on any given day, a reimbursable lunch, I should say. And for breakfast, we also saw an increase. We went up from 28.5% prior to COVID to 38.6% in October. Those participation rates increased slightly from September to October. And I mentioned we don't have information after October at this point. So we'll be watching that pretty carefully to see if it goes up again. Those rates were not as high as we might have expected. So they're kind of at the low end of participation that was assumed for the cost estimates. But we think that we've identified a couple of reasons that might be suppressing participation right now. So you shouldn't necessarily count on these being the long-term participation rates. It could still increase from there. So those factors are one, that in those schools that are operating provision 2, so that's about 221 schools this year. I mentioned there are 91 schools doing CEP. At those schools, in the first year of provision 2, we have to count the actual children who eat by name so that we can figure out, what their status is and claim the meals based on their status. The students are eating for free, but the federal reimbursement is based on the actual students who are eating. And so during COVID, when all the meals were claimed at the free reimbursement rate, or in the community eligibility provision where the same, we're just counting the number of meals and applying a percentage, we just have to count the number of kids who are eating. So it's, student goes through the line and you're able to count very quickly that yes, that meal is reimbursable and you're on to the next student. But when you have to count the actual name of the student eating, that means that either the student has to enter a PIN number or they have to swipe a card or they have to, the cashier has to look them up or, some schools still using a paper roster, so they might be checking them off on a paper roster. And that just takes a little bit more time to do that. And then you add that to the fact that more kids are eating. We saw that participation rate increase from 50% to 60% for lunch. So there's more kids in line. And so we're hearing from schools that the lines are just a lot slower and that they've had to pull staff off of serving or cooking in order to be at the point of sale. And so we think this decreases participation in a couple of ways. One is, most schools in Vermont, like a typical lunch period is maybe 20 to 25 minutes. And so if you're going to have to spend, if you're a kid and you're going to have to spend a bunch of time in line, if you have other options, such as bringing a meal from home or potentially not eating, you might choose to take those options rather than stand in line so that you have either more time to eat that meal that you brought from home or more time to socialize or go to recess. Some schools have kind of a combined lunch and recess period, so there's some incentive to reduce time spent in lunch so you can go outside and play. So for those reasons, we think we might be seeing a reduction in participation. That will go away once those schools are done with their base years of provision 2 and are back to just counting the number of kids who eat. So those lines will shorten up at that point. For some schools in Vermont, that will be next year. We do expect to see a lot of schools try and take advantage of those new direct certification numbers. And so they may choose to restart their provision 2 base years next year, which would mean they'll have that problem next year as well. But then the following year, they'll be back to just counting individual students.
Yes, Steve.
20 to 25 minutes for eating, that seems very short to me.
So there is no state law that sets what the meal time should be. There are some states that do set that. There are schools that address it in their school wellness policies, but at this point, there's no state or federal requirement for a minimum time. And that normally includes the time through the line as well as to eat. So when you're thinking about this amount of time, you want to account for that as well. We don't have actual data. I'm just telling you that's a typical time based on our observations when we go out to schools. But I would say it's rare that we see a lot longer than 25 minutes.
Can you just clarify, in the schools that are needing to count students by name, is that every student is entering a pin or swiping a card, going through the same process? It's not a different process for those who are being counted for?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a great point. And so so you're asking, so I'll explain to everybody else what I'm jumping to there is, you're asking if there is any overt identification of kids who qualify for free and reduced price meals. And depending on when you ate school lunch or when you last interacted with school meals, you may have actually seen overt identification because many, many years ago, there were different colored tokens or, different tickets or that sort of thing that free and reduced kids had to hand over, and that kind of identified them. That is strictly prohibited in the programs at this point. No overt identification is allowed. So every child who's going through the line is going through the same process. They're entering that PIN number or swiping a card or having their name recorded. And the cashier likely doesn't even know the status of the student. That's all calculated in an office, somewhere before they submit the claim to the state. So no difference for those students, but it's a slow process to get that rather than just to count the number of meals served.
Representative O'Brien.
Is there any data on whether the students who would have been available for free and reduced lunch with universal school meals are actually, a higher percentage of them are actually taking advantage of that?
So,
you see what I mean?
yeah,
Sort of like,
we have participation data for the first 2 months of the school year. And those data are showing that participation has fallen among those free and reduced categories, and participation has increased significantly among the paid category. But I would not assume from that those kids who are in the paid category, my assumption would be that represents households that were previously low income, not submitting applications, and therefore now falling into the paid category, and their students are eating in that category, rather than saying that as a result of universal meals, free and reduced kids are choosing to participate in the program less. It's much more that those kids are no longer being identified as free and reduced and counted that way and having their meals claimed that way. This is all assumption, but this is my assumption based on the data that we have. I haven't presented that full data to you about those different categories because, as I mentioned, the schools are able to carry over prior year eligibility until mid-October. So the September and October data doesn't really capture what our true participation rate is looking like at this point. And it won't be till we see November data where we'll be able to really say, this is what the participation is. So in the report, I have taken the new free and reduced rate this year, and I've applied it to our daily participation. And if participation does not increase at all beyond October, and students eat in equal proportion to their categories, so the free, reduced, and paid students all eat in proportion to their category, then we'd be ending up at spending about $27 million of state funds this year. It seems reasonable to assume that paid students are not going to eat more than free and reduced price students. We'll see if that plays out in the data. Or not eat at a greater proportion to their numbers. But I'm not sure about participation. So participation may still increase. And I mentioned there were a couple factors. So we talked about one, but there are actually two other factors that I want to mention to you all before we move on that could be decreasing participation. Does that get at what you're asking? Okay. So those two other factors are meal quality. Because schools are having to move staff off of the serving lines and cooking lines, we have, in order to count students eating meals. We have heard from some schools that they've had to like eliminate their customizable sandwich bars or eliminate some hot entree options, and that students are not participating as much because they miss those options. And that's, fewer offerings means lower participation. So when we're back to kind of normal on that, we may see that participation increases for that reason. The other thing is, in general, we're seeing lots of staffing shortages in the programs, and lots of, program directors reporting that they're having to fill in the kitchen more than usual and stuff like that. So I just anecdotally am hearing that meal quality is down as a result of that. We're not as able to do as much scratch cooking as we had been able to do. Prior to COVID, we had very high meal quality in the state. If you hadn't eaten school meals in a while, I would really encourage you to go back and eat a meal in your district and see what it looks like, because it's very different than what you may be remembering. The meal pattern changed about 10 years ago, and that's really had an impact on meal quality. But the meal quality is probably not quite as high as it was pre-COVID for that reason. And supply chain issues are also impacting offerings. At the last minute, something may be substituted that just doesn't make sense as part of your menu, but you've got to offer it anyway because you need to meet that component. And so the kid goes through the line and says, well, this is a weird meal. This doesn't go with this other item. I don't want food today, or I don't want this meal today. And over time, that can kind of erode participation. We don't have any hard data on that, but anecdotally, that's kind of what we think might be going on. And then the last thing that we think might be impacting our overall participation is just attendance. And the agency doesn't yet have attendance data for this year, but of course we all heard that there were a lot more respiratory viruses circulating this fall in addition to COVID. And so that may be suppressing participation as well, just because kids aren't at school. So I don't want you to take that 60% participation rate and kind of make, long-term decisions, assuming that that's what it's going to be. It could very well increase in the future.
Good questions? I had a question, and this may be in the report, but wondering about the numbers of schools you mentioned that are either provision 2 or community eligible. There are a lot more in the first category, which makes sense, I think. But I'm wondering whether those 91 schools, are they distributed evenly in terms of size, or do they tend to be bigger schools?
I wouldn't say, I haven't done any analysis. I wouldn't say overall that they tend to be bigger or smaller. So in order to participate in the community eligibility provision right now, at least 40% of your students have to be directly certified for free school meals. That's again from those other means tested programs. So doesn't matter how many households are returning applications, it's really about your direct certification number. But for CEP, we can group schools to get to that minimum percentage. And so you can group any schools within a school food authority. And in Vermont, a school food authority is the supervisory union level. You can group any schools in any way you want. So you can do the whole supervisory union, which is what Southwest Vermont has done for many years. Or you can group, 2 schools within the supervisory union, or any other combination. And you can play with your numbers as much as you want to try to get to that 40%. So I will say that in a couple cases, we saw, some smaller schools kind of tag on to a larger group. And so maybe you would see more small schools kind of getting into CEP that way, because maybe they didn't have the threshold, but they were able to tag on to a larger school in their supervisory union that did, without impacting those numbers terribly. My team worked really hard to make sure that every school in the state that we could qualify through combinations got there this year. So that would bring down the overall free claiming percentage for some of those groups, but it means that every school who could potentially get that additional 1.6 multiplier was getting it. So that's some of the work that we did this year to kind of try and maximize the federal funds.
Great. Representative Conlon, any questions in your room?
I'm just checking around the table. No, I think we're okay for the moment.
I'll just draw your attention to a couple other pieces of the report to take a look at. And, I don't know, we've gone over already. I don't know how much longer you want to spend on the topic today. But independent schools, I would say, were kind of the biggest area of contention. So Act 151 did include some language allowing for publicly funded students at independent schools to receive the universal meal supplement if that independent school was state approved and the independent school offered universal meals to all of their students. And we did hear from a number of independent schools who are really unhappy with that language, either because they weren't state approved, they were state recognized, so they didn't qualify at all. Or they had few publicly funded students, and so it didn't kind of make it worth their while to participate. Or in general, just kind of a feeling of unfairness that the rest of their students weren't included, the non-publicly funded students. We did have a little difference in how we handled this, and I would love some legislative direction on this going forward. That's how we handled the independent schools who were their own school food authority. And they are allowed to be their own school food authority as long as they are state approved, state recognized. They're allowed to participate in the National School Lunch Program generally if they're a nonprofit. So for-profit schools are not allowed to participate at all for federal. So we have those independent schools, about 20.
We are.
We are.